Yellow fever is thought of as the American equivalent to the Black Death, called yellow fever because when you caught it, your skin and your eyes would turn yellow. And as you got sicker and sicker, you begin to bleed from your ears, eyes, nose, and mouth as your organs shut down. Yellow fever was a very painful way to die. And during the summer of 1793, 5,000 people in Philadelphia died of this disease. That was 10% of the city's population wiped out in about 3.5 months. With so many people dying in such a short amount of time, it's no surprise yellow fever left behind more than one restless spirit. This piece of ground has served many functions, not all of them pleasant. For many years, during the late 17 and early 1800s, Washington Square was not used as a public park like it is now. Back in those days, this was used primarily as a potter's field. You are now standing in the middle of a Philadelphia graveyard where approximately 5,000 people are buried in unmarked graves. All those bodies are still here under our feet. They have never been moved. About 2,000 of the people buried here in Washington Square are unknown soldiers from the Revolutionary War. And what you see here behind me is a monument of the soldiers that rest in this ground with an eternal flame in their honor. Other than the soldiers, people buried in Washington Square include Native Americans, freed and enslaved African Americans, prisoners who died in the Walnut Street Jail, which used to be across the street between the square and Independence Hall. Also buried here are many victims of the yellow fever epidemic of 1793, also buried in mass graves all throughout this ground. So with so many people buried here, it seems only natural that Washington Square should be haunted. And over the centuries, there's one spirit who's been seen more often than any other and whose legend continues to survive. Back in the late 17 and early 1800s, when this ground was used primarily as a graveyard, it was very common for the grave diggers to make a little extra money on the side by selling fresh body parts and sometimes full corpses to doctors and to medical students so they could do research in human anatomy. This became so prevalent that Washington Square became known as the night market. There were no street lamps in Washington Square back then like there are today, so when the sun set it was pitch black dark here. And with the darkness, the grave robbers, also known as the resurrectionists, would come, digging up those who had been freshly buried and selling their body parts to the highest bidder. And of course, many people were disturbed and upset by the graves being robbed here in Washington Square, and among them was a mysterious old woman. People began to notice that as the grave robbing became a huge problem here in Washington Square, that every night, as soon as the sun set, when it got dark, a woman could be seen walking into this ground, and night after night she was dressed the same way. She wore a long, simple black dress, a dress a Quaker woman of the time would have usually worn. She also wore a long black cloak with a hood over her head, and she kept her head bent down, looking at the ground so no one could see what she looked like. And this woman would patrol Washington Square all night long, protecting the bodies buried here, frightening away anyone who dared to desecrate the graves. And when the sun rose and the morning came, this woman would leave Washington Square and then seem to vanish. Nobody knew where she went after she left this ground. No one had any idea who this woman really was. But people kept seeing her night after night, month after month, and year after year. So they had to call her something, and eventually they gave this woman the name Leah. This woman they called Leah was the guardian of the dead here in Washington Square for many years, for decades, until she became a very old woman. And as she grew older, her back became very stooped over, and her hands were badly crippled by arthritis, twisted up so it looked like she had claws instead of human hands. And eventually, as all people do, Leah died, and she died here in Washington Square. One morning when the sun rose and people walked back into this ground, they found Leah's corpse stretched on top of someone's grave. The cause of her death was a mystery. But the even greater mystery was her identity. To that day, no one knew who the woman really was. No one came forward to identify her or claim her body. So they had no choice but to bury this poor elderly woman's body somewhere here in Washington Square, in an unmarked, anonymous grave, just like the thousands that she had spent the last years of her life so vigilantly protecting. It soon became apparent that Leah's ghost was not at rest, because stories began to circulate throughout the city of Philadelphia, stories told by those who dared to come to Washington Square after sunset to dig up graves. They would tell of terrifying encounters with the ghost of Leah, even though she was dead and buried somewhere in this soil, and they would see her still cloaked and hooded in black, terrorizing those who walk here at night. And over the past 200 years and more now, the ghost of Leah has been seen pretty much everywhere in Washington Square, most often seen around the monument to the unknown soldiers that rest in this ground, and often appearing in photographs that people take when they're here. One of the most intriguing sightings of the ghost of Leah happened a few years ago to a Philadelphia policeman. This policeman said he was walking across the square very early one morning on his way to work before the sun came up. He said he was looking toward Walnut Street. He said he saw an old woman wearing a long black dress, a long black cloak with a hood. There was something about this woman that unsettled him, something about her that just wasn't right. He wanted to get a closer look at her. So he began to walk very slowly and cautiously towards this old woman, and he noticed that she was doing something very strange, that she was kneeling down, digging frantically in the soil with her bare hands. And the policeman said he began to call out to this woman and ask her if she was all right, if she needed any help, but the woman never once looked up at him, never gave any sign she even heard his voice. Finally, the policeman said he got so close to this old woman, he was about to reach out and touch her on the shoulder. And just as he was about to do that, she finally raised her head to look at him for the first time. And the policeman said that underneath the black hood this woman wore, all he could see was darkness. This woman had no face and no head. And a few seconds later, she was gone, vanished, nowhere to be seen. The policeman looked down at the ground where the woman had been digging, where he'd watched her dig for several minutes as he approached her, and he saw that now the soil was undisturbed. No one had been digging there. And the policeman said he had never heard of the legend of Leah before seeing her early that morning, and that he doesn't believe in ghosts or anything supernatural like that. But he knows what he saw. He knows it happened to him, and he still has a hard time trying to explain away what he experienced here in Washington Square. So, ladies and gentlemen, as we leave Washington Square to head towards our next stop, the Bishop White House, one of Philadelphia's most haunted houses, keep in mind that wherever you step on this ground, you're walking on someone's body. And take a good look around as we go. Maybe one of you tonight will catch a glimpse of Leah.
Whoa. I'm looking for her, and I'm gonna record her.
Just record. Are you recording the whole time?
No. I'm gonna record this part, and if I don't see her, then I'm gonna stop recording.
Okay, I was just walking that line.
Are you gonna jump in? I'm gonna look down here and expect to...
Oh yeah, that's awesome.
The thinner guy that turned the shutters down so I can see stuff.
What kind of camera is it?
But the sound.
Yeah, what kind of model?
2.5. I Rebel.
5.
Talk it. We have to hear.
I can't photo.
Caden?
Nope.
Staying with
Guys, we have to hurry up.
Colin, I'm gonna see a demon and you're not.
Oh, hey man, do you guys see that? Or don't you?
Colin.
No, do you see that?
I know, there you go.
Come on, we have to hurry up.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I bet when I stop.